Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and it's my pleasure and privilege to be moderating this panel. A very warm welcome to all our esteemed panelists. And we have a very intriguing topic today, right? Making India the unicorn capital of the world. So that's what we are going to be talking about. Well, clearly, first let me actually take a step back and say how we want to run this panel. I assume we have about 45 minutes. So very quickly, context setting, a couple of minutes, then we will dive into the discussion. We'll take up 3 or 4 substantive questions, maybe cover that through about half an hour or so. And then I would like to turn to you all to ask your questions, so we'll keep it interactive in that manner. Okay, so we are clearly in the golden era of entrepreneurship today, right? I mean, it's making headlines, entrepreneurs are sort of celebrities, if you will. A lot of attention in the popular media, in the press. Entrepreneurship is also now a very, very sort of central piece for policymakers, right? And there are a lot of initiatives by the government as well in promoting entrepreneurship in the country. And over the last 10 years, this has really taken off. Things have fallen into place. And today we have about 100,000 registered startups, which means probably twice as many, right? Those many don't get registered. So we have many startups that are coming up, a lot of venture capital flowing into the country, and last count, I don't know, 100 plus unicorns. We will leave it at that because we seem to be adding a few every month, okay? So now, when I talk about unicorns 100 plus, they are also the dominant narrative in the popular press seems to be around unicorns. So we'll just spend a few minutes. I would like to invite my panelists to just, what does a unicorn signify, represent? What does it really represent? And why the glamour? What is this glamour to be in this league? And one might even say an obsession with unicorns. So I just want you to take a couple of minutes and talk to me about what is your take on unicorns? Rohit, why don't you start?
Hi, good afternoon. I think before answering, I think just before diving into the question, just wanted to take the opportunity to acknowledge what the institution has done for me in the last, institution has been there for 50 years, but I literally came up with the business plan sitting in the corridors of the class, so I'm indebted to whatever has happened. So jumping into the topic, I think unicorn, the way at least I look at it, it's been a theory of evolution, right? The first time I got introduced to the word unicorn was about 2013, where Sequoia was investing in Cloud9, and a week before they had invested in Zomato. And the narrative was that they're going to be a unicorn company. I'd never heard that term before. I was like, what is a unicorn company, right? Then they explained. And, you know, in the overall rationality of things, if you look about it, we always talk about how our economy is growing, right? There's an ambition to be a 5 trillion economy. We became a 3 billion economy over the last 75 years. The pressure of having to overdo some of those things in the next few years to kind of double that capacity and stuff, right? So you are looking at global parity on some of these things. So a similar comparative would be the Global Innovation Index, where we were, maybe in the last 10 years, we were about 75 or so. We're now at about 40. So what that means is, you know, some of these commonalities in terms of how perception is formed. One of the biggest parameters is unicorns, because private organizations always lead into the public market, which is a lot more different milestone, where it's you know, it's more visible, it's more understandable. But in the private market, you still need yardsticks to go by, and the global index has been unicorn. So now when we talk about India being the, you know, amongst the 5 big economies, growing to become the top 3, we need some of these markers to be in place, and hence the obsession to kind of possibly look at what is global parity in terms of what a unicorn is. Now, the veracity of that in terms, while it's a mythical creature we know, hopefully the business models are not as mythical. But other than that, I think would love to hear from these guys as well. But that's where I would say it. I think it's a very essential marker to have.
So I'm exactly the opposite of him. I'm batch of 93, and I unfortunately hardly ever went to class. So somehow survived and hence became an entrepreneur.
That's because you didn't have the entrepreneurship course at the time. Now we do.
So I have a very different take on this whole concept of unicorn. I think it's like you said, Professor, it's sort of media-led, right? While I completely respect what Rohit is saying, that it's a marker for our global standing. I think it's far more important that we have more entrepreneurs in the country. We have more people giving other people employment. We have more companies being set up. And enterprise really is the key, right? Are we building successful companies? Yes, there's an external marker, which is a valuation, which I think the media celebrates more than the entrepreneurs, right? Because what your valuation is critical. I mean, obviously, we're here to create wealth. My view is that, and we debated this, making India the entrepreneur capital of the world is far more important. Because even the chaiwala, I mean, aunties from our time or Atika, are in a sense an entrepreneur who is providing a great service to that little community. And obviously scale is important, and hence unicorn. So my take on this is that yes, unicorn is a good marker, but how many unicorns is less relevant than how many successful startups, because a lot of startups fail, 90% is the number. So my take as in this is that unicorn is an interesting concept and maybe mythical, but successful entrepreneurship or successful companies is what we should aspire to as a nation. That we have more people starting companies, we have more people successfully running those companies, we have people getting funded as required. I mean, both my other panelists are also are VCs themselves. So that's where my take on this is.
A slightly different perspective on how this entire unicorn sort of term itself became so popular. I think it was excellent branding, right? If you look at how do founders or even investors signal that their company is doing well? When you're a private company, there's no external marker. You can't say I have 20,000 people. Nobody understands that, and so what, right? You could be an outsourced services company. Or you can't say I'm worth so much because nobody believes you, right? I mean, it's a mythical this thing. So somewhere I think this was a brilliant ploy to brand startups of a certain value, saying let's call them unicorn. And I think that term sort of caught the imagination of everyone. It's a mythical term, creature nobody's seen. And a lot of startups have been like that. They're not seen. Right? So they're not seen. They're in the background. So this was really an attempt, and I think led largely by some very smart founders and investors. I think both are guilty of having branded this very well. And it serves as an excellent marker. I mean, to take the cricketing analogy, it's like we are in cricketing season now. It's like a century, right? You score 100 runs. What's the big deal about 100 runs? 100. It's a nice round number. People love nice round numbers. A billion is a nice round number, and it's essentially that. And other than that, I don't think it stands for too much. Obviously, it's a marker of valuation of somebody's perspective. It's a marker of growth in the startup. But more than anything else, it's just a marker for external public, saying this is what I am. And I think it's done that job remarkably well.
Can I just extend the marketing genre there? Because I'm spending a lot more time as a VC than an entrepreneur nowadays, I got introduced to more terms. I've heard of minicon, I've heard of sunicon, unicorn, hectacon, decacon. I was also told about starting to think about a dragon. Dragon is something which will return the fund.
It's there in the menu.
There's no end to it. But there was also an Indian version I was introduced to called a horse, camel, and elephant, saying camels are some, like they take capital once, continue to go, right? And then stop and maybe take capital again. But they go far. And elephants are even like, they probably take capital once and then just keep continuing to grow. I was like astounded. So yeah, I think marketing, if we let them loose, I think it's...
As a founder, if you're filling a phone, if the question comes two con, so unicorn, unicorn, decacorn, whatever.
Yeah. So, I mean, if I were to just sort of summarize what you have talked about, there is a utility to it, right? I mean, it is a marker. It is an important marker for establishing some kind of credibility in the marketplace. It could be internationally or it could be to the broader ecosystem. But having said that, there is also a word of caution that Atul is saying that, it's not all about that. So let me pick up on that and say, okay, what makes a successful startup? I mean, does unicorn mean that you're successful? How do you want to sort of compare a successful startup? Is unicorn a successful startup? Are all successful startups necessarily going to become unicorns? Just quick thoughts on that. And maybe this time we'll start with you, Vipul.
Valuation is not an indicator of success because it depends on what market you're operating in, what kind of business you're building. Great unicorn companies have returned very little to founders and to investors. And there are very small companies which have done remarkably well in terms of returning capital to both for the founders and for their investors. So both, you see both ends of the spectrum when you start investing and when you work through startups. So I think that's not a great metric. I think if you look at a founding journey, really, there are three stages that I see. And each stage is very distinct and different. One is the seed stage, where you're really trying to figure out whether your product market fit. Am I going to survive? How do I survive? What needs to be done to survive? How do I know that I'm going to be successful? Which is really the discovery phase. You're a startup, but you don't know whether you're going to be successful or not. And there are certain sets of skills and capabilities which are required to, go from here. The next stage is really scaling up. I know broadly what works. Now is the time for me to really build this. How do I build this? What are the capabilities required? How do I build it into a successful startup? What is required to make this happen? And the third is really, and this is before you become public and become a fossil, is really saying, I've built this, I've started scaling this startup. How should I keep the momentum going? How do I continue? What do I do to make sure that this company, after I've scaled, continues to grow, continues to operate well, continues to do well, does well by its ecosystem, by its stakeholders. And those skill sets are very different. So there are three distinct stages. And I think the markers and the kind of capability required are very different.
Absolutely, yeah. And again, to your question, what's a successful startup? Depends on who's asking, who's telling. There are 4 or 5 stakeholders who are involved. There's the customer, first of all. So are you delivering a service which the customer is ready to pay for? Right? That's a real marker of success because there are lots of people giving away frees, which is no measure of success in my view. Are your employees happy? Are you able to provide employment as an entrepreneur? And are you able to create an environment where people thrive? Are you as a company able to bring certain size and scale? Right? That's success. Then, as Vipul said, are you able to return capital? Right? Especially if you raised capital to build your business, are you able to provide reasonable returns to the people who believed in you, who invested in you? So I think there are different markers for success for each, from depending on who's asking, who's telling, and obviously lastly but not the least, from the founder's perspective, is are you able to leave a legacy? Are you able to create something which you're proud of? Are you able to create something which has value, not in terms of valuation only, but in terms of brand, in terms of customer love, in terms of employee love? So yeah, this is a slightly philosophical answer, but different stakeholders have a different definition of success. And when they all come together, you probably get this mythical character called a unicorn. But that's my definition of success.
I'm going to obviously add to, completely agree with them. The way I would see it is probably, and I think this is where a lot of disconnects also happen. Entrepreneurs should always look at capital as finite, but their ability to perform as infinite, right? So any amount of capital is always finite, but people don't think of it that way, right? A lot of people build businesses which is just dependent on external capital. So very few people get away with something like that. There has to be a lot of things which fall into place to make that a viable option. But if you're a startup, I think, what needs to happen is you have to kind of understand that capital can only act as a catalyst. So beyond that, what is it that I can do, or a group of people can do in terms of building it as a sustainable initiative where it will continue to grow on, right? I actually feel that, again, going on the same marketing jargon, that I think the startup definition needs to have an end date. I don't think, like we can't keep referring to Zomato as startup. Sorry, right? But, after a while, you have to let it go. I mean, how do you differentiate otherwise, right? If there is a company which is throwing up a dividend or, doing something different, there has to be different parameters. Now, I don't know what we have to call them. But once you kind of leave the question behind about, hey, does the model even work, or is there even a unit level economics at some level to have viability index of some nature, I think that startup definition needs to change.
Great, thank you for those insights. So what I'm hearing you say is that, I mean, being a unicorn necessarily does not mean you're successful, and not being a unicorn does not mean you're not successful. And success has multiple parameters. Are you adding customer value? Are you returning, are you delivering returns to your investors? Are you leaving a personal legacy? And all of those things. So somewhere in all of this, it seems like we seem to be emphasizing one dimension, which is the investor returns, far more than other dimensions when we sort of obsess about unicorns, if I may say that. So I want to pick up on that thread and sort of ask you, now when an investor comes on board, right, a VC comes on board, and then there is this expectation of return, this expectation that you have to become a unicorn, because in some way it's a marker of valuation, it's a marker that you are able to deliver your returns. So how, as an entrepreneur, how do you balance this investor expectation of return with other measures or other markers of success that you've been talking about? And Atul, I will ask you to start this time.
So this is a pet peeve, so let me spend a couple of minutes on this. I think there's a fundamental, at some level, alignment and misalignment between an investor's life cycle and the entrepreneur's life cycle, right? Very often when seed stage investors come in, their marker of success is not the exit. Their marker of success, their key result area, is the next round of valuation, the next funding. Because when they report their NPV, and I'm speaking out of turn probably here, and I'm very heavily invested. I'm an Axel portfolio company. Both my companies are Axel portfolio, phenomenal venture capital firm. But somewhere along the journey of an entrepreneur, which is typically 10 to 12 to 15 years, before you actually make any size and scale, the time alignment is a big issue. And I'd love to hear from Vipul and Rohit on this topic, because if you start investing, typically 18 to 24 months later, you'd want the company to be revalued. And like you said, the only way to revalue the company is somebody puts in more capital, right? And this race to raise more capital at a higher valuation is where I feel there's a bit of a misalignment. Because ultimate exit only happens at some point in time, right? And that typically would be 10 to 12 to 15 years, unless iski topi uske sar wala game is not happening. So what I believe is that the VC plays a very critical role in your journey. This alignment of timing is where I think there are sometimes undue pressures which manifest itself in the bubble which happened in 2021. 2021 was basically everybody was just valuing every company slightly higher, so that collectively everybody's balance sheet was looking better. And it corrects at some point in time. Like you said, public markets are not so kind. They look at real value underlying those companies. So to your question, Professor, my answer is that yes, it's our responsibility as entrepreneurs to return capital and return on the capital because that's what they invested in. But this timing issue is where I think there is a lot more thought which needs to go in and a lot more open conversation need to happen to get this successful.
A little more, since your Axel is your investor and you have worked with them, give us some more sort of insights, specifics on how you manage this relationship with the investor. And I've heard very good things about Axel, but also.
No, I mean, I have to say this, and this is not being sycophantic. They are the best VC I feel in the country. They're phenomenally entrepreneur friendly. They give you time. I mean, they invested in Probe in 2010. 2011 is my first check. We've not given them an exit yet, and they're as supportive as ever. Scriptbox, we raised funding in 2013. They're still investing, and they're an early stage investor. So they've been phenomenal. But I have obviously been in the industry, in Probe especially, because we supply information to private equity venture capital firms. We interact with them very regularly. And we obviously are part of the entrepreneur circle. What you hear, this constant pressure to get revalued is the challenge. We've not felt it, so I'm not talking from personal pain. I'm talking from collective experience in this particular case. Yeah, that's the answer. That phenomenal journey on our behalf, on our part, but you can clearly see the pressure, right? I can imagine Shubroto having to report, yeah, I don't have a new valuation. So that's the challenge.
As long as you don't get the wrong investor, and there are obviously some poor investors, and the only way to avoid them is to do a little reference check. Most entrepreneurs do not do that reference check or don't do it diligently enough. When an investor comes in, they actually strip you threadbare. They look at all your finances, they do personal checks, they figure out what you have done in your past life, what your colleagues thought of you, what your bosses thought of you. So they do a very rigorous diligence. Most entrepreneurs are guilty of not doing the same thing with the investors. And I think that's extremely important. And the reason it's important is, if you get the wrong investor on the board, you're dead for life. Even if you do well, you'll be in trouble. Even if you don't do well, you're in worse trouble. And so I'm speaking from experience, I'll not name names. But you can get really bad investors, and it doesn't make sense at all to have them on your cap table, right? But assuming you do that diligence and you get them out of the way, I think most different investors have different perspectives, and while there is some misalignment, I think it is quite easy to handle them by following one or two rules. One, be completely transparent. And this is difficult for us to do because you do not want to convey bad news, right? You don't want to say, I don't know, when you are the CEO or the founder, and you don't want to admit that you made a mistake. And these are the three things that hold you back. I made a mistake, I don't know, and things are not going well. And this is when, because if you think of investors, take a seed stage investor or early stage investor like an Axel, they are playing a portfolio business. They know 10 out of 10 bets, some 2-3 are going to go duds. So it doesn't phase them. This is built into their model. 3 or 4 of them may just return the capital. 1 or 2 may return the fund. So therefore, if you go bust, you don't have to cry yourself to death saying that that guy is not making money. So they're used to it. But the problem that happens with investor relationships, and the root cause of most problems is, the investor discovers that there's a problem and they discover it very late. And that's when the trouble starts. Then they start blaming you and they say, you didn't do this, you didn't do that, and you get into an ego cycle, and then it's just downhill from there. So I think it's just about transparency. The second is about involvement. Force your investors to get involved. Investors like to be not involved, right? Investor wants to give the money and say, forget about it and give me back 10x my money in 5 years. Brilliant. I don't have to do any work at all. Who doesn't like it, right? Now, it's your job to make sure that you force your investors to meet you every month. I remember when we started Big Basket, and this was the third company, so by that time we had learned, we told our early stage seed and early stage investors, we'll meet every 15 days. And we met every 15 days for the first 2 years of our existence. And what that did was, they were involved in running the company, they know what we were doing, they know what we were doing next week. So he couldn't come back and tell me, no, you didn't do this. He was as involved in decision making. I mean, I would have told him, you should have told me then. Why are you telling me in post facto? So I think it becomes much easier. And then they're also thinking very constructively. They're looking forward and saying, okay, this is the way to, maybe this is what we should try, or maybe this is the risk we should take. Their ability to participate with you becomes much, much higher. Otherwise, they don't participate. They're bystanders and observers. So
is there a downside to it, though? Is there a downside to involving them, meaning they're too close to operations now?
No, there's no downside.
Okay.
Right? As long as you educate them, and also you see, it's a relationship where that guy has to respect you and you have to respect him. For a period of time, it develops. It always starts out where you think he tells you, no, why don't you try this? And over a period of time, he realizes that you are doing what is best, and you have to take their inputs, and you can't always take every input and implement it. It doesn't work like that. And as long as the investor realizes it, which is why I said good investor, and 80% are good investors. So it's not that they're very hard to find like unicorns. They're much easier to find.
Rohit,
Again, agree with these guys, but I think I just want to add another caveat that if you think of this asset class in itself, right, and I know this timeline well because graduated from here 2010 and struggled to even have a meaningful conversation. Forget capital as an outcome, just to go say hello to somebody was so difficult. You don't know who's a VC, who's a P. If you think about that, the average life cycle of a particular fund is anywhere between 10 to 12 years, right? At best, we're in a 15-year sort of window. So people haven't seen enough. The ecosystem hasn't evolved enough to kind of appreciate what goes on into something like this. Unfortunately, we do a lot of things with borrowed conviction on what happens in the developed markets where this asset class has been there for the last 40 years, where they've seen a lot of these life cycles and founders are also that much more better. Why do we all go after founders who already raised capital when they're building next time? Doesn't matter what the idea is, they get flooded with offers, right? Because they understand how to kind of do some of these things together. So I think this expectation mismatch also stems from the fact that we're a fast evolving country, especially in this asset class. Like if you see the quality of crop between the last 5 years, and if you do a 5-year split every time, you will see that the last 5 years have been better than the years before because they've learned from the previous one. So I think it is going to evolve, and as we try and, bring upon a lot more unicorns as a parameter again, I think the quality of unicorns or quality of companies getting built is actually going to be very, very, very different from what was before, right? So just wanted to leave
I think
that
that's a fair point, and a lot of points that Atul and Vipul made in terms of how do you actually manage the investors? What is the dynamic between the entrepreneur and the investor? A lot of this is learnings that we are accumulating as an ecosystem, and it's likely to get better. So I'm told that we need to wrap up this panel at 1:15. So I will ask one more question from my end and then open it up. I think we have put a lot of ideas on the table, and I'm sure you all have a lot of questions also, so that we have at least 10 minutes for audience Q&A. So my last question to you is, forget whether we call it a unicorn or whatever it is, but what it stands for is scale, right? We are talking about an organization that's substantially scaled up, that's creating a lot of jobs, and there's enough research to show that you need these high growth enterprises in an economy because they really power the economy. So talk to us a little bit about, and maybe I'll start with you, Rohit, this time. What does it take as an entrepreneur to go from, let's say, 100 million onwards to 1 billion and beyond? In terms of building the org, what are your sort of 3 things that you would recommend to entrepreneurs?
To entrepreneurs, I think I'll try and relate myself to what worked well. I think storytelling is very, very important. A lot of people underplay the utilization of something like this, where you're able to deliver the vision to to someone who's joined you on day 0 to someone who's joined you yesterday, right? I think the unified outcome of a shared vision is very, very high. A lot of people just don't do enough justice to kind of translate that into actions or, visible actions, which then constitute to how do you deliver on the vision and the mission and all that. So I think I would urge everybody to kind of do this. And Professor Vasanthi is here. I don't know if she remembers. She was one of the ones who actually nudged to say that, why all these are important. She's nodding, but I don't know if she remembers. I think storytelling is very important. And the other thing is, I think building with utmost transparency. I think a lot of things will go wrong. There will be very few entrepreneurs who will think that, everything is hunky-dory as you read it in the media and stuff. For every good day, you probably have like 15 bad days that are behind it. I think, again, understanding and learning from something like this, and again, making sure that we don't repeat those mistakes are very important. So transparency in communicating outside as well as inside, I think, is, again, super critical. And I think, for me, again, one guiding parameter has always been go back and look at your unit level economics. It has to continuously improve, or, it cannot deteriorate. Any new initiative that you take, it has to have a lifetime within which you kind of understand that it's either adding to the ULE or, eroding from it, right? So these are certain things you have to do. One last point that I've actually kind of enjoyed is try and disrupt within rather than having to wait for external factors to kind of show the disruption, right? So the minute, like a lot of these unicorns, right, one of the things that they do is actually set up new categories. So they create new dimensions in which users can then be, or consumers can then be actually attracted with. So they always have that enviable position to actually lose. So how do you kind of build from there? So 100 million is honestly a very, very strong responsibility of a company. It's not a joke, right? So between 100 to a unicorn, you still have to continuously do this. So I would say, try and disrupt within also and see what comes from that.
If I were to pick one thing amongst the $500 million thing that an entrepreneur needs to do well to scale, I think the single biggest thing in my opinion, and I've seen this across companies and across at least the companies that I've been associated with in some form or the other, is actually process, nothing else. Everything else comes secondary. And when I say process, I really mean paying attention to your business and figuring out what are the key elements of it and documenting every element and documenting how it should be done and continuously reviewing it and building a visibility into the metrics which make that process work and then monitoring it and then reviewing it and then improving it. And this is a classical, the old Japanese Kaizen structure, but that is the fundamental building block or scaling block of any organization. If you go from 100 to billion, you're not going to be able to do it unless some VC gets happy and trigger happy and writes you a check, which is then very fictional. You can actually go back to 100 million too. The fact is, unless you build that business and the only way actually, as a founder, actually you'll be satisfied is that you have scaled the organization. And now this becomes it's a very different skill. It's drudgery actually. It requires a lot more attention to detail. Requires you're putting your nose to the grindstone and therefore it is hard work. It is not about dreaming ideas and strategies and fundraising and all of that, which is very exciting and which is what you're doing or you're in your early phase. So a lot of founders find it difficult to transition to a very operating, very hands-on, very granular role. This is about doing countless meetings. As a founder, you hate meetings. Right? The last thing you do, my job now is only meetings. When I started, I had nothing to do with meetings. So therefore, how do you scale that? How do you manage your expectations? How do you transform yourself into leading meetings better? How do you make sure that you understand processes, every process in granular detail? Today, at Big Basket today, I think the only key thing that we have, which I think is our key strength, it's not the brand, it's not it's the fact that each of the founders understands at least all the process in the company to granular detail, as well as the guy who's running that process. So I think that is very important. You are not running the process. I am not doing delivery every day, right? I am not picking goods in the warehouse. I'm not getting delivery from suppliers. I'm not meeting suppliers to negotiate terms. But there is a process defined for it. There is visibility into the metrics, whether the process is working well. And you have therefore continuous improvement in everything that you're doing. And that allows you to scale.
Thanks. I'll add a little bit to that. I absolutely agree with that. So the analogy we use and I always talk about, it's like building a hotel, right? So when you start up, you're deciding, should it be a business hotel? Should it be a leisure hotel? Where should I locate it? Then you decide you got some funding or you put money in, you get in the architects, you get in the designers, then you build the hotel, you get in masons, carpenters, in the kitchen, you're getting somebody putting kitchen equipment. When you're running the hotel, you need chefs, you need waiters, you need front office staff. So the kind of people you need at every stage of the company is very different. So to run these processes is actually the challenge. So if you think about that analogy that what got you here won't get you there, and finding the right teams to run these is extremely critical. And here as an entrepreneur, you always struggle. There's this loyalty versus competence debate. People who are with you, who joined you as masons, and now you expect them to suddenly start running the front office. It doesn't happen. So understanding the right people for the right roles and putting them in the right processes is extremely critical to scaling. It's not easy, but yeah, it's got to be done. And that's where you have to take some hard calls about people, about what's really important for the organization. So combining all of these, storytelling, right people, right processes is probably some part of the mantra. And I'm talking about 100 million to a billion in terms of not valuation so much, but revenue or scale and just size.
I mean, it's basically a proxy for scaling, right? Okay, great. I think we will open it up for questions.